having an absent father doesn't just mean that he wasn't there in the house. It can also mean that he was present, but you just never got time with him. He never talked to you. He didn't encourage you. Those types of things, I think, are very damaging. And the interesting thing that's starting to come out of the research of this is that there's nothing necessarily wrong with a single parent household for young girls. So on average, young girls are going to survive that single parent household better than young boys. Young boys on average are going to really, really struggle without some kind of father figure around. I think there's two other things that I would just bring into the mix of like why this is happening, because it's a multi-faceted issue. I think in our modern culture, it's so common that people want to have it be very black and white. It's like, well, this one thing is causing the problem. And it's like, almost never, like pretty much if you hear somebody, I'm not saying any of us have done this, but I was just talking about the culture. Like if you hear somebody saying this is the one contributing factor to the problem, they're almost always wrong. They're trying to peddle something, some ideology, some opinion, some perspective that, benefits them in some way. But I think the other contributing factors to this are, one, we are living through what I write about in the book as the plague of absent fathers. And so again, right, 1 in 4 children in America will grow up without a father figure present in the household, or, right, absent father as defined by the Palgrave Handbook of Men, which is one of the largest psychological literature on men in psychology, is it doesn't mean that your father wasn't in the house. It can mean that your father was there, but was working constantly, to no fault of his own, right? Maybe that's what he had to do in order to put food on the table, in order to make sure that the family survived, that the rent was paid or the mortgage was paid and people had food to eat. It can mean that he was an addict, and that he was there again, but he was sort of emotionally absent, or that he was just completely emotionally disconnected. So having an absent father doesn't just mean that he wasn't there in the house. It can also mean that he was present, but you just never got time with him. He never talked to you. He didn't encourage you. He didn't take you to practice. Like those types of things, I think are very damaging. And the interesting thing that's starting to come out of the research of this is that there's nothing necessarily wrong with a single parent household for young girls. So on average, young girls are going to survive that single parent household better than young boys. Young boys will come out of a single parent household. And I know this is hard to hear for some people, right? Because there are some people out there that are like, well, I'm a single parent. But we have to be able to look at some of these things to be able to say, okay, well, then what do we do about them, right? So young boys on average are going to really, really struggle without some kind of father figure around. And the data and the research backs this up in the sense that 85% of all kids who show behavioral disorders come from fatherless homes, which is 20 times the national average. 63% of youth suicides come from fatherless homes. 90% of all homeless kids, right? 90% of all kids, teenagers who run away from home come from fatherless homes, right? And so you can just go down the list and see that this has a net negative impact, and who it's predominantly impacting negatively is young boys. So I think that fatherless piece has been a huge part of it. And then the other one to just sort of throw out there is that I think in many ways we have been telling men now for a number of years, maybe for decades, that they're not needed socially and culturally. And that is psychologically damaging, right? To say you're not needed, or you're dangerous. And so a lot of young men are like, well, how do I be a man in a society that is telling me that I'm not necessary to be in a relationship with, or I'm not necessary within the workforce? It's a little obscure. So I think a lot of young men look out on the content and the narrative that's being sort of positioned online. And oftentimes what they're hearing is all men are dangerous, all men are this way, men aren't needed. And there's this narrative that's being propagated to the point that, like, you can go on Google right now and type in, would the world be better without men? And guess what you'll find? Hundreds of articles by people who are asking this insane freaking question. And some of them are coming up with the answer of like, yes, the world would be so much better without men. So, I think that doesn't help. It just that I would be remiss to say that that doesn't help, because a lot of young boys specifically are hearing that. And then they're hearing this very rigid, one-dimensional version of what it means to be a man from certain individuals online, and they buy into it because there's purpose, because there's meaning, because they're saying, hey, you actually do have value, and it draws them into what can be maybe an unhealthy framework. So I think that those are also two contributing factors that we just need to sort of throw out there.